All right. Good morning, everybody. So happy to be here another year, but this time with a lot more people. So my name is Eduardo. I'm also go by the name of Pozva on GitHub and Twitter, if you use those social media. And I'm a front-end developer. I'm also a member of a Vue.js core team. And more specifically, I focus on Unplugin Vue Router, which I'm the author. But I also build other libraries or frameworks, more libraries like Vue.term UI, Vuefire, and other smaller libraries. And when I build these libraries, I always end up feeling like designing APIs is hard. And I think this comes as something very obvious to a lot of people, maybe not for others. But it goes without saying that this is one of the biggest challenges of any open source library, is that you want to make an API that feels good, and you have to balance out many different factors at the same time. You have to balance out that there is no bloat in what the surface API you write, that you have something that feels intuitive to write, to use, something that has a good developer experience, depending on how they use that API. And also you have to think about the learning process of the API. So how do you learn that something is doable or not? Do you have to read the docs, et cetera, et cetera? And all of these, it also depends on the language you're using. It's not the same to design an API for Java that to do it for JavaScript. It's not the same to do something in an old language like Pascal or C that doesn't change anymore than to do it in JavaScript where the spec is ever evolving. And I think that at the end, it comes down to a feeling of how does it feel to use this API? How do you feel when you use the API? And today I want to talk about how I think are some of the good metrics, although you cannot really measure it, but how I think a good API should be. And I think that, first of all, on any good API, errors should be hard to make. If making a typo creates an error that you cannot really see until a runtime, it's going to make you feel dumb. And of course, nobody likes to feel dumb when they're using something, right? Also, you want to avoid any context switch, or at least as much as possible. And this is not as easy as it seems, because sometimes you are dealing with the code, but also the file system, or the browser, or any other plugins that are in the browser to develop your application or whatever you're building. And it's not just about how your option is named or how many options your API has, but you have other ways of interacting with an API. And also, how much boilerplate do you have to build a feature? Do you have to go through a lot of code to find the actual piece of code that it's doing something in your application? And at the end, you also have to cater for different perspectives. So is this the first version of the API, or is this the second one, or the third one? Do you have an existing user base? Can you afford having break-in changes? How these break-in changes are affecting the existing users? Do you target new users as well? Because as humans, everything new is a little bit sexier, right? Everything new feels a little bit more interesting. And at the same time, when you are used to something, you don't want to change. So you have to be careful about that, because when you are on a V2, it doesn't feel as new as something with a new name, even though it's new. But on top of that, it also feels like changing for other users, for existing users. And so I like to put this into a graph. So I want to show you this meme that you might have seen before. It's an old one. It's just some learning curves. Now, learning curves do not make something better or worse. It's subjective. But the idea is, on the x-axis, you have how much time you spend learning something, learning a tool. Here, an editor. And on the y-axis, you have how proficient, how efficient you get with the tool. So for example, Notepad, you cannot do much. So you get to the top level very quickly. On the other hand, the joke with Vim or VI is that you need to learn a lot before even be able to use it, with a known joke of I cannot exit VI. And then you have things like Emacs, which apparently is so powerful you can even travel space-time and go back into learning curves, right? And I don't even want to talk about Spacemacs, which I'm not even sure a lot of people know about it. But it's a great editor, by the way. So if I apply this to the API ergonomics, how can we talk about making an API great? I think that given a set of features, if you use a feature very often, you should be able to write it more easily and not feel like you're learning something new. So that's why on the x-axis I have, I go from I use this feature every day to I use this feature once a year. And then on the y-axis I can actually guess how I use this API, how I implement it, how I change it, or I go to I need to search the documentation. And you can even go worse that you need to search multiple documentation to actually do what you want. And so you might think that sometimes this is linear. The truth is it's never really linear. But the idea is you probably want to go for something more like this. You want for features that are very common to be very easy to do. You want to spend less time, not only you want to spend less time writing the feature or interacting with the code or whatever you're using to program, but also you don't want to have to go to the documentation every time you have to use them. It's better if you can actually guess from the existing code base, for example. And I think it's fine. This is a comparison to the previous curve. It's fine if the less common features are actually harder to use or require more documentation, as long as the other features that you use every day are so much easier that you're going to save so much time doing this way. So that's why today what I want to talk to you is the route to success. The talk title is not routing any features. That's very lame. But that's indeed what I sent first to Josh. Sorry. So to Vue Router, what does that mean? It means, in my opinion, that we can improve keeping things together. We can make some changes to move that forward. We can also reduce the repetition. So this means that you can write less code to iterate faster. And keeping things together allows you to also reduce context switch. And the whole thing allows you to improve the developer experience. But also, I think having errors, having less prone, how do we say that? Having less error prone, being able to make less errors is always better. I think, though, that when it comes to routing, it's a widely misunderstood concept. And I want to differentiate unknown from misunderstood. The DOM is unknown to most people, yet they use it very efficiently through frameworks. Routing, you cannot really escape it sometimes. And people diverge in terms of opinions on how the URL should look like, the encoding that should be used, what are the good practices in navigation, cross, or same document. It goes very complicated. And honestly, I don't even blame anybody who feels weird about routing and thinks it's shit, because we have weird, ever-changing APIs. We were using hash a few years ago, and now it's bad for SEO, so we shouldn't use them. We have multiple ways of changing the URL. We can use location, we can use push state. We have also multiple ways to parse it, but careful not to use a very old browser because they don't support it. And then you have multiple possible ways to detect navigations. You have event listeners that are different, and they are not always compatible with each other. I don't even want to talk about Internet Explorer. I'm glad it's not a browser anymore. And you even have upcoming APIs that haven't been approved by every browser. So who knows if we ever see the light where these features come into place. And to top it, we have a lot of things coming together. So we have the URL, which can be considered application state. But we also have page transitions. That's UI. And we have data fetching, which is Morote. So many parts of the application logic that come together in one layer. And then we have a non-exhaustive list of vocabulary here that just makes things more confusing, like things with name routes and name views. Good luck knowing what the difference is without reading the docs. So I think there is a lot of things that we can improve. When we look at these, we want to simplify things. And we want to also make things less error-prone, because look at how we define routes. We define a path, we define a name, and then when we push, it's so easy to just make a typo, right? And not have an error until we run the code. It's so easy to make it in different places. So here, the name shouldn't have the slash, and the push should have a slash because it's a location. But of course, nothing really tells you that from the code. So can we simplify the router? And the answer is, of course, yes. And if you look at the thing that you do the most often, I would say, or maybe not the most often, but the most basic feature of a router is to create a route. Now, when you create a route, you usually create a file as well, and you say, this file is going to correspond to this path, and other options as well. Now, we can, of course, reduce the whole process to just creating the file and using the file structure as the routing. But then we have other issues, like how do I configure the route if I no longer have access to that object with the path and the component? Which is what leaves a lot of people thinking, do I really want to do that? And some of you might be thinking, of course, I already know this. I already use it. Who has used file-based routing before? Nuxt, SvelteKit, anything? So that's, I think that's probably half of the people at least. It's difficult to count. And I think this is a good starting point to not only reduce the repetition, but more things as well. So the idea is, in Nuxt, we are also sometimes, sorry Nuxt, but we're sometimes compromising flexibility. And I want to know who hasn't or who doesn't like fail-based routing for whatever reason. OK, we have only a few hands, which is nice. I couldn't count, but I think it was less than 20 hands. Now, the idea is, this is one argument we hear very often. I don't want to use fail-based routing because I feel like I'm going to be blocked in this lower-level API. I mean, not lower-level, but inferior API, which is files. And so today I want to show you why file-based routing can be better, actually, than manually writing it. So when you do file-based routing, we have a predictable one-on-one mapping between a file and a route. This makes things more predictable. More predictable also means less error-prone. OK? So without going into the details of the syntax, you have some conventions that are very easy to learn because they are sitting right next to your editor all the time. So you don't really forget about them. You see them every day. So we have parameters that are created with brackets, for example. An index.vue just creates a slash at the end of the route. And then you can create folders to structure the different sections of the URL. But the idea is, you can do this manually, right? You can write your own routes array by yourself. But the idea is, we have tools that generate the code for us. So why not let them generate the boring part so we can work on the fun part, right? So that includes route records and imports. That's what you have with Nuxt, for example. But I want to go way further. I want to go into typing routes, so reducing any errors you can make with navigation, and having data fetching also improved, and other things that I won't be able to explain throughout the talk. And because when you think about route records and imports, this is something that has been done for a long time. Katashin from the core team was also working on this as a Vue CLI plugin in 2018. So, and there is today other plugins like Vite plugin pages by Han. So today, let's talk about what are type routes. Type routes is, instead of doing a push and not having any information about if what you're doing is right or not, if you pass params that do not match here, for example, I should be passing an ID, you should be getting an error. And for those who have used TypeScript with complex types, maybe Pinia, you may have noticed that sometimes the errors in TypeScript are these big chunks. You have type A is not assignable to type something not assignable to type something else. Then you have 3 dots, and you have never is not assignable to string. And you go, what the hell happened here, right? So you have these 3 dots actually contain the important information. That's where the actual error is, but you never get to see them. And we can actually get very, much better errors here. I'm going to show you that afterwards. And it goes on, right? If you try to match a name that doesn't exist, you also get an error. If you filter out a route for a name that doesn't contain a param, you're not going to be able to check that param because we're sure it's not going to exist. And so we implemented this with TypeScript, which I regretted afterwards. I'm going to explain why. Now, it was very cool. You have a type that takes one generic. That generic is a string, a literal, and it gives out an object of all the params. And it supported all of these. This worked, OK? I really wrote the code that worked for this. So you even have the custom regex. They were not parsed. I'm not going that crazy. But you also have repeatable params, optional params, multiple params, etc. And it was really cool because the only thing you had to do afterwards was mark the array of routes at const. And then it was very easy to extract some kind of map that will associate each name of each route to the param, sorry. And then you can just index them very quickly. But turns out it had poor performance. would have thought? So the runtime types get really slow, and this is because of, I'm going to show you in a moment. But I discovered it the hard way, I would say. I was just testing out with adding routes. I wanted to stress test my types, and I was adding routes. It was working fine when I was auto-completing, and then I would add one route. I would just crash TypeScript. I don't know who has crashed TypeScript before. Some people. So at these, and when you look at the types, you can imagine that they're not very simple. And this one I'm actually proud. I would say it's not too bad. You can see we have only like 4 deep ternaries. It goes way worse. Okay, way worse. You have to do pretty much implement a parse. Tokenizer or parser in TypeScript, which is not very, how do you say, idiomatic. It's not very idiomatic, given the fact that you only have ternaries as a condition, as the only condition you can do. You can change the source code, by the way. So I asked myself, what do I do? Should I just drop this feature? Should I rewrite TypeScript in Rust? Of course, probably not a good idea. So I went back to the basics, and I said to myself, if I have to write this manually, I can just have an interface, and I can say each key is the name of a route, and then I can have all the information. This removes a lot of the performance bottlenecks. And afterwards, it's very easy to get all the names. It's just a key off in terms of TypeScript. And then it's very easy to also create types that accept a generic being the name of the route to give you a more precise version of all the possible route params. So that means that we can type all the other helpers that we know. And so that's why I introduce you today Plugin Vue Router, which is an automatically typed file-based routing. So how does it work? It's a plugin for Vite, Rollup, Webpack, etc. Choose your poison. And you put it the first as a plugin. You can configure it to give it a different folder, different regex to say which are the pages I want, ignoring patterns, etc. And then you only need to replace all the imports that go from Vue Router to Vue Router Auto. This Vue Router Auto is actually some kind of proxy to Vue Router, but all the types, are augmented with what your project has in the files. So the good thing is that you're still in control. You still create the router instance, but you don't pass the routes array. That will be pretty much the only difference in terms of API, okay? You don't pass the routes array. You can, though, extend the routes if you want. Now, what does it do? Well, just by using it, you can replace all these manual push that you do before. You don't even need to use encode URI anymore. You can just push, add a name, and if you try to autocomplete the name, you will get all the possible routes. These are files that you have, okay? And of course, you can search them and type them as you want. And if you try to add the params and you pass the wrong params, you're going to see that you get an error. Now, if you look at the errors here, it's actually readable. It's not a junk of 3 dots TypeScript that we usually get. So that's a cool thing. You can see that the name is there, and if we add the only possible parameter, name, then everything becomes typed, and everything just doesn't fail anymore. So we can remove that line and replace it with the other one. In other places, if you're using the route is now a union of all the possible locations in your application. But sometimes that doesn't match the page you're at. Here, we are in a name.vue, so we know that we have a name parameter. But because we are not doing any check, the name doesn't exist in all the routes. So here, we can pass a generic saying, this route is actually the brackets name, high brackets name route. And by doing that, we are coercing to a very specific route here. So the only possible params that we have is the name. And because this doesn't autocomplete, I decided to also add it as a parameter. So that way you have the autocompletion. It's way more comfortable. And this reduces greatly all the typos and all the errors that you can make and you wouldn't be making if you had types. But today, we still see a lot of errors like that. How does it work? It works by creating a DTS file. Now, without going into the details, you have what I said before, the params, and then you have these Vue Router auto module that exports other types, extended types. But what about configuring the routes, the things we could do before? So we have this kind of macro define page, which if you have used Nux before, you know define page meta. It's very similar, except that you can just declare all the properties. And we can also use a route block, which is something that exists in other plugins like Vue plugin pages. And the way it works, it's pretty simple. You just call define route here. And for example, if we're using the route with a name here, and I change the name of this route, because it's exactly that route we are on, I save it, I'm going to get an error because that route doesn't exist anymore. So forget about, you can catch all these errors on CI before deploying, so you don't have any link that is broken to a non-existing page. And I think this is just the tip of the iceberg, although it's already a good improvement. I want to talk a little bit about data loading. I won't be going into the full details of it, because it's a huge topic. But I think it's still very important, because today we have really a lot of different ways to do it. We can just watch any param and trigger a fetch function, but you have no loading state, no error, no SSR. You can use before route enter and other navigation guards, but you have duplication of code, you have something that is very verbose, and not every guard can be typed. And then you have router before each, which means you are implementing your custom data fetching solution, which means you're basically implementing a library. And then you have suspense await, which I have a full slide for it. But all of them have issues, OK? So for suspense await, what is the problem? Suspense await actually has a lot of pros. It's very straightforward to write. You just await something. It has even a limited, which probably will improve error handling. And it handles SSR. However, it's still experimental. So if you base your data loading around suspense at the moment, chances are that you will not just use suspense like I'm doing here. You're going to also check the pending state, the error states. So you're going to integrate deeply with the API as suspense, which creates a little risk of migration later on. It also doesn't update the navigation, and the data is limited to the current component, which means you cannot use that user profile in another component unless you put it into a store or provide it as a prop, or provide it as that. So what I'm showing today is data loaders. Data loaders are functions that you pass to other functions. So you have this define loader function that receives a function where you can return any information you want, here a user profile. And as you can see, what you get is a composable. It starts with use. And I'm exporting that composable. More about that in a second. And so because it's declared right above in a different script tag, which is the only downside, I would say, you can use the composable right away. So you have access to the data, but also the pending. You can refresh. You have the error, et cetera, et cetera. And the data is always available when you enter the page. It doesn't have an undefined state, unless you make it lazy, but that's another topic. And what do we have to export the loader? We export the loader to let the router know that this page component requires this loader to be fetched. It also allows you to reuse that composable in any page or any component. Okay? You can use it absolutely anywhere. Kind of like a mini store, so you don't have to use a store in it. I'm not trying to replace Pinia, don't worry. But that also means that you completely dedupe request. You can use this composable in many places. You will see I have only one request to the user API. You have all the requests are followed by default, but you can make them sequentially if you want. And it can be typed, because you can also pass the type of the current route, so you know that the route is going to be a specific type, so you have specific params, et cetera, et cetera. You can also export multiple loaders. They will be parallel by default. You don't have to do anything particular. You don't have to wrap them with some function. It would just work. You just export them. So if you want to know more about this, there is a lot more to cover. The RFC is quite long, and I'm actually not even done writing it. But it's already public. It has been public since August. It's not limited to file system routing. You don't have to use file system routing, but it's better. It has a pragmatic client-side cache. Now, I say pragmatic because client-side is a very complex problem that I don't really want to dive too much in. And it works with any asynchronous function. And the goal is not just to make it work with regular data fetching, but also with libraries like Vue Query, Vue Apollo, Vue Fire, etc. And I just want to warn you, it's still experimental, so the data loader API can change, and it will probably change for the best. To sum up everything, why should you use file-based routing? I think that when we have these one-on-one mapping routes to file, we are having a more predictable, just a predictable routes array. So you can create, or you can let tools create all these types for you, which makes errors less likable to appear, or even sometimes impossible to make. And this is thanks to TypeScript, but not only. It also reduced a lot of the boilerplate, because not only you are going to write less code because of file-based routing, so you don't have to write the routes array, but also you benefit from auto-completion a lot. Now I know some of you are probably using Copilot, but Copilot also makes mistakes, and a compiler doesn't make any mistakes. That's the difference. So you can also stay all the time on the same file, because you only have the file, you reduce the routes to the file, you have this one-on-one mapping, you can add and configure the route within the Vue component, so everything in one place, no context switch, better experience. If you want to check further, what do? You can check the Unplugin Vue Router repository, work in progress, but the file-based routing is unlikely to change. It's based on Nuxt, has the same conventions. So there is a link there. You have a demo as well if you want to try the things I show you by yourself. And you can find the slides on esm.ease or RTS, which doesn't stand for real-time strategy, but route to success. And I'm glad that I showed you these. I have been working on these for some time. I hope that some of you try it, and thanks for your attention.